The phone didn't just ring, it screamed. A high-pitched, digital shriek that sliced through the 3 a.m. silence of Dr. Evelyn Reed's sterile, minimalist apartment. It was the sound of a life hanging by a thread. She was out of bed before the second ring, her heart already pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The screen glowed with the one number she both revered and dreaded. Chicago General. "Reed," she answered, her voice raspy with sleep, but sharp with focus. "Dr. Reed, it's OR 4. We have a situation." The voice on the other end was young, tight with panic. A resident. "It's the pediatric heart transplant. The recipient, 10-year-old Sarah Jenkins. We're getting persistent VFib. The donor heart isn't taking. We think the cardioplegia is wearing off too fast." Evelyn's blood ran cold. Every word was a hammer blow. "Not this one. Please, not this one." She was already pulling on her scrubs, the phone pressed between her ear and shoulder. "Did you try a magnesium drip? What's her core temp?" "We've tried everything, doctor. We're losing her. You need to be here now." The last word was a plea. Evelyn didn't need it. "I'm on my way. Keep her chest open and keep paddling. I'll be there in 15 minutes. She hung up, not waiting for a reply. 15 minutes was a lie, a prayer. From her apartment in the Gold Coast to the hospital on the west side, even with deserted streets, it was a 25-minute drive, minimum. She snatched her keys and bolted out the door, the ghost of another child, her child flickering at the edge of her vision. Failure wasn't an option. It was a demon she'd already faced once, and she would rather die than face it again. Her hospital-issued sedan, a sleek, black Audi, tore out of the underground garage and onto the dark, rain-slicked asphalt of Lakeshore Drive. The city lights blurred into long, neon streaks. The speedometer needle climbed past 70, then 80. Every red light was a personal enemy, every empty intersection a gift. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Her world narrowed to two things: the road ahead and the failing heart of a 10-year-old girl. She didn't see the shadows, didn't notice the quiet watchers of the night. She only saw the finish line. 5 miles away, Officer David Evans sat in his patrol cruiser, parked in the deep shadow of a freeway overpass. The rhythmic thump of his windshield wipers did little to soothe the coiled tension in his shoulders. The night shift was a beast of its own, long stretches of profound boredom punctuated by moments of pure, adrenaline-fueled terror. Tonight was a boring one, which somehow made it worse. It gave him too much time to think. He thought about the weight of his badge, a weight that felt heavier on him than it did on Miller, his partner, or the other guys. It wasn't just metal and enamel. It was a target and a shield, a burden and a responsibility. For a black man in this uniform, it was a constant, grueling performance. Too soft, you were weak, letting your own people down. Too hard, you were a sellout, a tool of the system that had chewed up men like his father. You had to be better, smarter, more controlled than everyone else, just to be considered equal. A flicker of headlights in his rearview mirror broke his reverie. A black Audi moving like a missile. No, not a missile, a threat. It weaved through the sparse traffic with an arrogant, reckless grace. David's focus sharpened instantly. The quiet observer was gone. The hunter had taken over. He saw the make of the car, the clean lines, the subtle gleam of wealth even in the dark. A familiar switch flipped in his mind, a cold, hard click of prejudice he'd never admit to anyone, not even himself. It was the kind of car that sailed through life in the fast lane, piloted by people who believed the rules were for others, the kind of people who had lawyers, not consequences, the kind of people who had let his father's killer walk free because justice, he'd learned long ago, was a luxury item. He pulled out from the shadows, the engine rumbling to life. He didn't hit the siren, not yet. He just fell in behind it, pacing it. 85 in a 55. That was more than enough. He flicked the switch. The world exploded in strobing red and blue light. Inside the Audi, the sudden blast of color in her rearview mirror felt like a physical blow. Evelyn's heart leaped into her throat. "No, no, no," she whispered, her voice cracking. She slammed a hand on the steering wheel, a flare of pure, helpless fury. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 8 minutes gone. Every second now was a stolen heartbeat. She pulled over to the shoulder. the cruiser parking directly behind her, its high beams pinning her in a merciless glare. She watched in the side mirror as a figure emerged, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the deliberate, unhurried pace that was unique to law enforcement. It was a walk designed to communicate absolute control. Evelyn rolled her window down as the officer approached. The man who stood there was an imposing presence, his face set in a stern, unreadable mask. "License and registration, ma'am," Officer Evans said. His voice was deep, even, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Officer, please," Evelyn began, her own voice tight with a desperate urgency she couldn't conceal. "I'm a surgeon. There's an emergency at Chicago General. A child is dying. I have to get there." David heard the words, but his brain filtered them through years of excuses. He'd heard it all. "My wife is in labor. My dog is sick. I have a flight to catch." The more expensive the car, the more dramatic the excuse. He shone his flashlight into the car, a quick, sweeping motion that felt invasive. He saw the designer bag on the passenger seat, the pristine interior. He saw a wealthy white woman in a hurry, not a life-saving surgeon. "I understand, ma'am, but you were driving over 85 miles per hour, weaving through traffic. I still need to see your license and registration." His tone was a flat wall. No negotiation. Frustration warred with panic inside Evelyn. Why wasn't he listening? "I don't have time for this." The words came out sharper than she intended, laced with an exasperation that sounded, even to her own ears, like arrogance. David's jaw tightened. There it was, the entitlement, the quiet assumption that her emergency was more important than the law, more important than his authority. "The law doesn't take a break for emergencies, ma'am. Step out of the vehicle, please." Evelyn stared at him, incredulous. "Step out? Are you serious? I just told you a child is dying." "You're failing to comply with a lawful order," he stated, his voice dropping a register, taking on a harder edge. His hand drifted down, resting almost casually on the grip of his service weapon. It wasn't a threat, not overtly, but it was a reminder of the power dynamic. "Now, I'm not going to ask you again. Step out of the car, slowly." Defeated, Evelyn killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. She got out, the cold, damp air hitting her face. She felt a tremor run through her hands from adrenaline or rage, she wasn't sure. He led her to the rear of her car, keeping her in the blinding cone of his headlights. He took his time. He ran her license. He ran her plates. Each moment was an eternity. She could picture the scene in the OR, the frantic beeping of failing monitors, the desperate faces of the surgical team, the growing sense of hopelessness. She was here, standing on the side of a highway, while a little girl's second chance at life slipped away. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, he returned with a ticket book in his hand. The methodical scratch of his pen on the paper was the cruelest sound she had ever heard. "This is a citation for reckless driving and excessive speed," he said, handing her the flimsy piece of paper. "Your court date is on the summons. You're free to go." Evelyn snatched the ticket from his hand without a word. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. She got back in her car, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fit the key into the ignition. As she pulled away, she didn't speed. There was no point. She glanced at the clock. 26 minutes had passed since the call. 26 minutes. She knew, with the chilling certainty of a surgeon who has seen death 1,000 times, that it was over. The race had been run, and she had lost. Not in the operating room, not to a medical complication, but right here, on the side of a dark, empty highway. The life she was racing to save was already lost. The automated doors of the hospital slid open with a soft whoosh, a sound Evelyn usually found comforting the whisper of a sanctuary. Tonight, it sounded like a sigh of judgment. The air inside was thick with the familiar smell of antiseptic and the less tangible scent of managed despair. She walked, not ran, down the gleaming linoleum corridor toward the surgical wing. The urgency had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, heavy dread. Dr. Michaels, the head of pediatric cardiology, and a man whose placid demeanor had weathered decades of medical storms, met her at the OR doors. He didn't need to speak. The defeat was etched into the lines around his eyes, the sag of his shoulders beneath his green scrubs. "We lost her 5 minutes ago, Evelyn," he said, his voice a low rumble of sorrow. "We did everything we could. The new heart just wouldn't stabilize. We ran out of time." The words hit her not like a shock, but like the final, dull confirmation of a truth she already knew. A profound emptiness opened up inside her, a chasm so vast it swallowed her breath. She leaned against the cool wall, the tile pressing into her back, grounding her. She saw Sarah Jenkins' face in her mind's eye, a photograph from her patient file, a bright, gapped-toothed smile, and eyes full of a hope that was now extinguished. "The parents?" she asked, her voice hollow. "I just told them. They're in the family waiting room." Dr. Michaels paused, his gaze softening with concern. "You look wrecked. What happened? You said 15 minutes. Then, Evelyn closed her eyes, the strobing red and blue lights of the police cruiser burning against the back of her eyelids. "I was stopped, pulled over for speeding." She opened them, her gaze hard and clear. "I explained the situation. I told him it was a pediatric emergency. He didn't care. He made me get out of the car. He ran my license. He wrote me a ticket while her heart was failing." Michaels stared at her, his usual composure cracking with disbelief and then hardening into a cold anger. "He what? You told him you were a surgeon on your way to a code?" "I begged him," Evelyn said, the memory tasting like ash in her mouth. "It made no difference." "This is unacceptable," Michaels stated, his voice now dangerously quiet. "This isn't just a matter of professional discourtesy. This is a catastrophic failure of public service. This officer, this man didn't just delay you. He became an active participant in a fatal outcome." "How?" A resolve began to crystallize within Evelyn, sharpening the edges of her grief into a fine, dangerous point. It wasn't just about Sarah anymore. It was about the principle, the arrogance, the absolute abuse of power that saw a uniform as a license to be deaf, blind, and cruel. It was about the ghost of her own daughter, whose loss had taught her that sometimes the fight is all you have left. "I want his name," she said, her voice steady now, infused with a chilling purpose. "I want his badge number. I'm filing a formal complaint. With the department, with the city, with whoever will listen. He's not going to walk away from this." Dr. Michaels nodded slowly, seeing the formidable surgeon he knew so well resurface from the depths of her grief. "Good," he said. "The hospital's legal team will back you. Every step of the way. This can't be allowed to stand." "Oh." The next morning, the fluorescent lights of the 18th District Precinct felt unnaturally harsh to Officer David Evans. He'd finished his shift feeling a grim satisfaction, the kind that comes from imposing order on a chaotic world. He had upheld the law, without fear or favor. That's what he told himself as he filed his report, logging the black Audi's excessive speed and the driver's uncooperative and agitated demeanor. He was halfway through a stale coffee in the break room when his partner, Officer Frank Miller, slid into the chair opposite him. Miller was a 20-year veteran, a heavy-set man with a weary smile who had seen it all and had the cynicism to prove it. "Heard you pulled over a real speed demon last night," Miller said, munching on a donut. "Black Audi on the drive." David nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "Yeah, some rich lady in a hurry. Tried to give me a song and dance about being a surgeon on her way to an emergency." Miller stopped chewing. He looked at David, a flicker of genuine concern in his eyes. "A surgeon? You sure? What was her name?" "Reed, I think. Dr. Reed," David said with a shrug. "She had the attitude to go with it, acted like the law was a minor inconvenience she shouldn't have to deal with." Miller put the rest of his donut down. "Dr. Evelyn Reed, the neurosurgeon from Chicago General, the one they call the Saint because she does all that pro bono work on kids with brain tumors." David's confidence wavered for a fraction of a second. "I don't know about all that. All I know is she was driving like a bat out of hell and copped an attitude when I did my job." "Davy," Miller said, using a nickname he reserved for when he thought his younger partner was being a fool. "This isn't good. If it really was her, and if there really was an emergency, you better hope your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed on that report. People like her don't just get mad. They get results." David bristled at the implication. "I did everything by the book, Frank. What was I supposed to do? Just let her go because she said she was important? The rules are the rules. For everyone." His righteousness felt solid, impenetrable. But later that day, when Sergeant McAllister called him into his office and shut the door, the first cracks began to show. McAllister, a man whose face seemed permanently carved into a scowl, tossed a file onto his desk. Evans, we have a problem. The file had a formal heading. Civilian Complaint, Internal Affairs Division. David's stomach tightened. It's about your traffic stop last night, the one involving Dr. Evelyn Reed. McAllister leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowed. She claims you willfully obstructed her from attending a medical emergency, resulting in the death of a 10-year-old patient. David felt a jolt, a sickening lurch in his gut. The death of a patient. He hadn't allowed himself to believe her story. It was just an excuse, a lie, to get out of a ticket, wasn't it? That's not what happened, Sarge, David said, his voice strained. She was driving recklessly. I followed procedure. She never provided any proof of an emergency. Proof? McAllister scoffed. She's one of the top surgeons in the country, Evans. Her word carries a hell of a lot more weight than yours. The hospital's legal department contacted the city this morning. They're calling it depraved indifference. They're not just filing a complaint, they're threatening a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the city, with you named as the primary cause. The room felt like it was shrinking, the air growing thin. David's carefully constructed world of black and white rules was dissolving into a terrifying shade of grey. I was doing my job, he repeated, the words sounding weak even to himself. Your job might cost this city a fortune, and you, your career, McAllister snapped. The complaint has been accepted. Internal Affairs is opening a full investigation. As of now, you're on administrative leave, pending the outcome. Hand over your badge and service weapon. The final words were delivered with bureaucratic coldness. David stood there, stunned into silence. He unclipped the badge from his uniform, the metal suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. He placed it on the desk next to his gun. The symbols of his identity, of his authority, of everything he had worked so hard to achieve, now sat on the other side of a desk, belonging to someone else. As he walked out of the precinct, stripped of his uniform and his purpose, the grim satisfaction he'd felt just hours before had curdled into a cold, terrifying fear. Frank Miller had been right. People like her didn't just get mad, they got results, and he was now facing the full, devastating force of those results. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. David's apartment, usually a refuge from the chaos of the streets, became a cage. The silence was the worst part. It was a loud, accusatory silence, broken only by the drone of daytime television and the frantic, looping arguments inside his own head. He replayed the traffic stop 1,000 times, each time tweaking the details, searching for the moment he could have done something different. But his pride and his deeply ingrained sense of procedural justice always led him back to the same conclusion. He had followed the rules. The rules, however, weren't protecting him now. They had abandoned him, leaving him exposed and powerless. The union rep had been sympathetic but non-committal. Internal Affairs had subjected him to a grueling 7-hour interview where every word he said was treated with suspicion. The story had been leaked to a local news blog, a short, salacious piece that painted him as a callous monster. Cop's power trip blamed for child's death. He was no longer a person, he was a headline. His only anchor in the storm was his son, Leo. At 12, Leo was a bright, wiry kid with his father's serious eyes and his mother's easy smile. Smile David hadn't seen in years, not since she'd passed. Leo was his whole world, the reason he put on the uniform every day, the reason he fought so hard to believe in a just and orderly world. You okay, Dad? Leo asked one afternoon, finding David staring blankly at the television. He held a basketball under his arm, ready to head to the park. David forced a smile, the muscles in his face feeling stiff and unfamiliar. Yeah, buddy, just tired. The department has me on a special project, working from home for a bit. The lie tasted bitter. Leo, perceptive as always, seemed to sense the falsehood, but didn't press. He just nodded. Okay, I'm going to the courts down on Cermak. Be back before dinner. Be careful, David called after him, the 2 words a reflexive prayer he uttered every time his son walked out the door. He watched from the window as Leo's small figure disappeared down the street, a pang of love and fear tightening his chest. An hour later, David's phone rang. It wasn't the sharp, official ring of the department or the apologetic buzz of his union rep. It was an unknown number. He let it go to voicemail, not having the energy for another reporter or a misdialed call. A moment later, the phone buzzed again. A text message. "This is Chicago Med. We need you to call this number immediately regarding your son, Leo Evans. It's an emergency." The world tilted on its axis. The air rushed out of David's lungs. He fumbled with the phone, his fingers thick and clumsy, his heart hammering against his ribs with a violence that made him feel sick. He dialed the number. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and terrifying. "Mr. Evans, this is Nurse Ramirez from the emergency department at Chicago Med. Your son was brought in about 20 minutes ago. He was the victim of a hit and run." David was out the door before she finished the sentence, his keys in his hand, his mind a white-hot blank of pure panic. The drive to the hospital was a blur of blaring horns and screeching Tyreshi's blaring horns, his screeching tires. The irony was a razor blade in his throat. He burst through the emergency room doors, his off-duty status, his suspension, all of it forgotten. He was just a father. "My son," he yelled, his voice raw. "Leo Evans." A nurse intercepted him, guiding him with a firm, compassionate hand toward a private waiting area. "The doctors are with him now, Mr. Evans. He's in critical condition. Severe head trauma. Every parent's nightmare." The words were clinical, detached, but they landed like body blows. David collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands, trying to breathe. Minutes stretched into an hour. Finally, a doctor in blue scrubs, his face grim, entered the room. "Mr. Evans, I'm Dr. Chen, head of the trauma unit." He pulled up a chair, his expression one David had seen too many times from the other side, the look of someone about to deliver devastating news. "Leo has sustained a severe traumatic brain injury. There's significant swelling and intracranial bleeding. To be blunt, without immediate surgical intervention, he won't survive the next few hours." "Well," David looked up, his eyes pleading. "Then do it. Whatever it takes, just do it." Dr. Chen held up a hand. "It's not that simple. The nature of the injury, the location of the hematomate's extremely delicate. It's pressing directly on the brainstem. Most surgeons wouldn't touch it. The risk of paralysis, or worse, is astronomical." "Most surgeons?" David latched onto the words. "You're saying there's someone who can?" Dr. Chen took a deep breath, his gaze steady and serious. "There is one person, one surgeon in this city with the skill and the nerve to even attempt a procedure this complex. She's the best there is. We've already put in the call to her." Hope, fragile and desperate, flickered in David's chest. "Who is it? What's her name?" Dr. Chen looked down at his chart, then back at David. The name he spoke was quiet, matter-of-fact, and it landed with the force of a wrecking ball, shattering what was left of David's world. "Her name is Dr. Evelyn Reed." And the name hung in the air, an impossible, suffocating presence. Evelyn Reed. For a moment, David was sure he had misheard, that the universe couldn't be so profoundly, exquisitely cruel. He stared at Dr. Chen, waiting for him to correct himself, to say another name, but the doctor's expression remained unchanged, a mask of clinical sincerity. It was real. The woman he had wronged, the woman whose complaint was dismantling his life piece by piece, the woman who likely hated him more than anyone on the planet, was now the only person standing between his son and death. The irony was so immense, so grotesquely perfect, it was almost a physical force, pressing the air from his lungs. He felt a dizzying wave of vertigo, the hospital waiting room swimming before his eyes. "Mr. Evans, are you all right?" Dr. Chen's voice sounded distant. David shook his head, trying to clear the fog. She won't do it," he stammered, the words tasting like poison. "Not for me. Not for my son." Dr. Chen frowned, confused by the reaction. "Dr. Reed's professionalism is unimpeachable. If the procedure is viable, she will perform it. She's reviewing Leo's scans right now in the surgical conference room, down the hall to the left." He stood up. "I need to get back. A nurse will let you know when she's ready to speak with you." Ready to speak with him. The thought was terrifying. What could he possibly say to her? How could he face the woman whose life he had inadvertently helped shatter and ask her to save his? The weight of his pride, his anger, his self-righteousness, All of it crumbled, leaving only the raw primal fear of a father about to lose his child. He walked out of the waiting room like a man in a trance. The hospital corridor felt a mile long. Each step was a battle against the urge to turn and run. He reached the conference room door, the small brass plaque reading surgical consultation, looking like a gateway to his own personal judgment day. He could hear the low murmur of voices from within. He raised a hand to knock, but it trembled so violently he had to pull it back. The door opened from the inside. A young resident stepped out, nearly colliding with him, and then David saw her. Dr. Evelyn Reed stood in the center of the room, her back to him, staring at a series of brain scans illuminated on a large screen. She was wearing surgical scrubs, her hair pulled back tightly. Even from behind, she radiated an aura of intense, formidable competence. She turned, sensing his presence, and their eyes met across the room. Recognition dawned on her face, but it wasn't a flash of anger or shock. It was a slow, dawning horror, as if she were looking at a ghost. The clinical mask she wore cracked, and for a fleeting second, he saw the raw pain he had inflicted upon her. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with the unspoken history that lay between them. It was a silence filled with the ghost of a dead girl and the fading life of a young boy. David's throat was dry. The carefully rehearsed apologies, the desperate pleas he'd imagined, all vanished. He was stripped bare, left with nothing but the truth of his desperation. He took a hesitant step into the room. "Dr. Reed," he began, his voice a broken whisper. He didn't know what else to say. Evelyn's gaze shifted from his face to the illuminated scans on the wall, her expression becoming distant, professional again, though her knuckles were white where she gripped a pen. She was retreating into her work, into the one place she was in complete control. "The patient is your son," she stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes," David managed to say. "Leo." She walked over to the scans, her movements precise, economical. "He has a grade 4 epidural hematoma, complicated by a subdural bleed. The impact fractured his temporal bone, driving a fragment dangerously close to the medulla oblongata." She spoke in a clipped, detached monotone, as if lecturing a group of students. "It's a catastrophic injury. The surgery to relieve the pressure carries an exceptionally high risk. We could lose him on the table. If he survives, he could be left with permanent neurological deficits." She was laying out the facts, but David heard the subtext. She was telling him how hopeless it was. She was preparing him for the worst. Or, a dark voice whispered in his mind, she was telling him why she shouldn't do it. He closed the distance between them, stopping a few feet away. He had no authority here. No badge. No power. He was just a father. Begging. "Please," he said, the word tearing from his soul. "He's all I have. I know what I did. There's nothing I can say. But my son, he didn't do anything. He's just a kid. Please, don't let him pay for my mistake." Evelyn turned to face him fully. Her eyes, which he remembered as being sharp with anger on the highway, were now filled with a profound, weary sadness. She saw not the arrogant officer who had belittled her, but a man shattered by the same terror she knew so intimately. She saw a parent on the precipice of losing a child. In that moment, she wasn't just looking at the man who had cost Sarah Jenkins her life. She was looking at a reflection of her own past, of her own desperate pleas to a universe that wouldn't listen. The Hippocratic Oath was a sacred vow, but this went deeper. This was about the ghost of her own daughter, whispering that no child deserved to die, regardless of the sins of their father. It was a test of her humanity, not just her skill. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "I will do everything in my power to save him," she said. Her voice was cold, professional, a surgeon's promise. But beneath the ice, David heard a flicker of something else. Not forgiveness. Not yet, but a shared, terrible understanding. "Now, please wait outside. I need to prep." She turned and walked out of the room without a backward glance, leaving David alone with the glowing images of his son's broken brain. He sagged against the wall, the tension draining out of him, replaced by a hope so fragile it felt like it could break him. He had placed his entire world into the hands of his enemy, and she had accepted. The operating room was Evelyn's kingdom. Within its sterile, blue-draped walls, The chaos of the outside world ceased to exist. There was no grief, no anger, no complicated history. There was only the problem and the solution. Her team moved around her with the silent, intuitive grace of a unit honed by years of practice. The hiss of the ventilator, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, the low hum of the machinist was the symphony of life, and she was its conductor. Leo's head had been shaved, a stark, antiseptic white against the pale skin. A web of wires and tubes connected him to the machines that were keeping him alive. To the others in the room he was the patient. To Evelyn, he was the ghost of every child she had ever fought for, a canvas of fragile humanity. She pushed away the image of his father's desperate face and focused on the task at hand. "Scalpel," she said, her voice calm and commanding. The first incision was a fine, red line, precise and unwavering. For the next several hours, time lost its meaning. Evelyn worked with a fierce, single-minded concentration, her hands moving with a dexterity that seemed almost supernatural. She was navigating the most complex landscape in the universe: the human brain. With microscopic instruments, she began to evacuate the hematoma, the pool of blood that was crushing the life out of Leo. The pressure monitor began to reflect the change, the numbers ticking down from the red zone of catastrophe. A collective, unspoken sigh of relief rippled through the OR team. They were making progress. But as Evelyn worked deeper, near the site of the bone fracture, she found something that didn't belong. "Suction," she murmured, leaning closer, her brow furrowed beneath her surgical loops. Tucked against the jagged edge of the temporal bone, partially embedded in the soft tissue, was a tiny object. It was metallic, misshapen, and dark. It wasn't a bone fragment. It wasn't surgical debris. "What is that, doctor?" the resident assisting her asked, peering over her shoulder. "I'm not sure," Evelyn replied, her voice carefully neutral. She worked with infinite care, using a pair of microforceps to gently dislodge the object. It came free with a soft squelch. She placed it into a sterile specimen cup. "Let's get this to pathology. But flag it for me personally. I want to see it as soon as we're done here. Crew. End of 7. All en masse. End. 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 End of 7. She returned her focus to Leo's brain, her mind racing. The object was small, no bigger than a grain of rice, but it was profoundly wrong. The official report was a hit and run. A car strikes a pedestrian. It causes blunt force trauma. It shatters bone. It does not, however, typically embed a small, deformed piece of metal deep within the wound track. This felt different. This felt intentional. Outside, in the starkly lit surgical waiting area, David paced. The floor tiles had become a map of his anxiety, each 4-foot square a territory he had crossed 100 times. His partner, Frank Miller, sat in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, a silent, steady presence. He'd arrived an hour ago, bringing 2 cups of burnt coffee that David hadn't touched. "Any word?" Frank asked for the 10th time. "Not since she went in," David said, his voice raw. 3 hours ago. "She's the best, Davy," Frank said, trying to sound reassuring. "If anyone can pull him through, it's her." "Has." David stopped pacing and sank into the chair next to his friend, rubbing his face with his hands. "This is my fault, Frank. All of it. I was so wrapped up in my own pride, so determined to be the law, I couldn't see the person in front of me. I pushed her, and now—" He trailed off, the words catching in his throat. "You're a good cop, David. A good man. You made a mistake in a high-stress situation." David let out a bitter laugh. "A mistake? I was on a high horse, Frank. I saw a fancy car and a white woman, and I made a judgment. The same kind of judgment I've been fighting against my whole life. I became the very thing I hate." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Remember when I told you about my dad?" Frank nodded slowly. He knew the story. David's father, a respected community organizer, had been shot and killed years ago while trying to mediate a gang dispute. The shooter was a low-level thug, but the man who ordered the hit, a powerful real estate developer named Marcus Thorne, had walked away without even being questioned. his high-priced lawyers burying the investigation in paperwork and technicalities. Thorne, he was untouchable, David said, the old anger a fresh wound. He drove a car just like hers, lived in a high-rise just like hers. I saw her, and all I saw was him. I saw someone who thought they were above it all, and I was determined to prove them wrong. I let my past cloud my judgment, and now my son is paying the price. Just then, the doors to the surgical wing swung open. Evelyn Reed stood there, her face hidden behind a surgical mask, her expression unreadable. David and Frank shot to their feet. Evelyn pulled down her mask. She looked exhausted, her face pale, but her eyes were clear. The surgery was successful, she said, and David felt his knees go weak with relief. We were able to relieve the pressure and repair the damaged vessel. He's stable. Oh, thank God, David breathed, tears welling in his eyes. Can I see him? He's being moved to the pediatric ICU, she continued, her tone still professional, but a new, complex note had entered it. He's in a medically induced coma to allow his brain to heal. The next 48 hours are critical. We have to wait and see how he responds. She hesitated for a moment, her gaze locked on David's. There was something else she wanted to say, something that went beyond the medical report. But the hallway was too public, the audience of nurses and orderlies too wide. I'll have a nurse take you to the ICU waiting area, she said instead. She gave him a look that was both a warning and an invitation, then turned and walked away down the corridor, leaving David caught between the overwhelming relief of his son's survival and a new, unsettling feeling that the nightmare was far from over. The pediatric ICU was a world of hushed tones and soft, rhythmic beeping. Leo lay in the bed, looking small and fragile amidst a tangle of wires and tubes. His head was wrapped in a pristine white bandage, a stark contrast to the scrapes and bruises on his face. David sat by his side, holding his son's limp hand, tracing the lines on his palm as if he could will life and consciousness back into him. He hadn't left the room for more than 5 minutes at a time, surviving on vending machine coffee and the sheer force of his hope. On the third day, as a pale morning light filtered through the window, the door opened quietly. It was Evelyn. She wasn't wearing scrubs, but a simple pair of slacks and a blouse. She looked less like a surgeon and more like an ordinary person, though her presence still carried an undeniable authority. She held a small, clear plastic bag in her hand. Inside was the dark, misshapen piece of metal. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice low. She glanced at Leo, then back at David. Somewhere private. They went to a small, empty family consultation room down the hall. The air was stale, filled with the ghosts of past griefs. Evelyn placed the plastic bag on the table between them. "This was in your son's head," she said without preamble. The pathology report came back. "It's a bullet fragment, specifically a deformed piece of a point, .22 caliber, jacketed hollow point round." David stared at the object, his mind struggling to process the information. A bullet, not a car accident. This was an attack. A targeted hit. Why wasn't this in the police report? Evelyn continued, her gaze sharp, analytical. The paramedics' initial assessment mentioned nothing about a gunshot wound. The ER doctors missed it. If I hadn't found it by chance during the surgery. She let the sentence hang in the air, its implication terrifying. David's cop brain, dormant for days, roared back to life, pushing through the fog of his fear and guilt. He looked at the fragment, then at Evelyn. "They wouldn't have been looking for it," he said, thinking aloud. "A hit and run creates massive blunt force trauma. A small caliber entry wound, especially to the head, could easily be mistaken for a laceration from the impact, especially if there was no exit wound. The shooter must have used a suppressor. No one heard a shot. So this wasn't random," Evelyn concluded, her voice firm. "No," David said, a cold certainty settling in his gut. "This was an assassination attempt on a 12-year-old boy. They ran him down to cover their tracks, to make it look like an accident. The question wasn't what happened anymore, it was why. And who?" His mind raced through his recent caseloads. The drug busts, the domestic disputes, the robberies. It all seemed too small time for this level of ruthless, calculated violence. Then, a darker memory surfaced. A case he hadn't officially been on, but had been digging into on his own time before his suspension. A new, sophisticated drug syndicate moving into the West Side, run by a ghost nobody could identify. They were violent, efficient, and they had connections. "I think I know who might be behind this," David said slowly. "There's a new crew in town. They don't like attention. Before I was sidelined, I was getting close to identifying their supply chain. Too close, maybe. Rend. A strange new dynamic settled between them. They were no longer cop and complainant, victimizer and victim. They were two people with a shared, urgent purpose: to find the people who had tried to murder the boy in the ICU bed down the hall. "What do you need?" Evelyn asked, her transition from surgeon to strategist seamless. "I need information," David said. "I'm suspended. I have no access to department resources. I'm locked out of the system. I need the full, unredacted police report on Leo's accident. I need the witness statements, the traffic cam footage, everything. The hospital's legal department can subpoena those records," Evelyn said immediately. "Given the new evidence, a judge would grant it in a heartbeat. I'll make the call." "Thank you," David said, the words feeling inadequate. He looked at the woman across the table, the woman he had treated with such contempt, who was now his only ally. "Dr. Reed." "Evelyn, why are you doing this?" She looked away for a moment, her gaze fixed on the sterile wall. "When my daughter Lily was sick," she began, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it, "I promised her I would never stop fighting for her. I lost that fight, and for a long time I think I stopped fighting for anything. What happened to Sarah Jenkins, and what I saw in your son's head, it reminded me of that promise." She met his eyes, her own filled with a fierce, rekindled fire. "The people who did this to your son, they believe they can operate without consequences. They believe they're above the rules. I know what that looks like, and I will not let them win." The alliance was forged. Over the next few days they worked in the shadows. Evelyn's lawyers secured the case files. She would spend her nights after grueling shifts in the hospital, poring over medical jargon and forensic reports, while David, holed up in his apartment, analyzed police procedure and witness accounts. He called in favors from the few cops he still trusted, speaking in coded language over burner phones. His partner, Frank Miller, was his most vital link. He met David in a dingy back alley, handing over a flash drive. "This is everything from the scene," Frank said, his voice low, his eyes constantly scanning the street. "Traffic cam footage from the intersection a block away. You're not getting this from me, understand?" "I understand," David said, pocketing the drive. "Thank you, Frank. Just be careful, Davy. If you're right about this, you're poking a very dangerous bear." That night, David plugged the drive into his laptop. He watched the grainy footage, his heart pounding. He saw Leo on his skateboard waiting at the crosswalk. Then he saw the car. A dark-colored sedan, no plates. It didn't slow down. It accelerated. He froze the frame just before impact. He couldn't see the driver's face, but he saw something else. A small detail on the passenger side dashboard. A parking pass. Faded, pixelated, but just legible enough. It was a parking pass for the 18th District Police Precinct. The chill that went through him had nothing to do with the night air. The call wasn't just coming from outside the house, it was coming from inside. The image on the laptop screen burned itself into David's mind. A police precinct parking pass. It was a detail so small, so innocuous, it would have been missed by anyone else. But to David, it was a brand, a glaring symbol of betrayal. The enemy wasn't just a shadowy drug syndicate. They had a man on the inside, one of his own. His blood ran cold. He thought back over the last few months. Who had he talked to about the new syndicate? Who knew he was digging into their supply chain off the books? He had been careful, but not careful enough. He trusted too easily. He called Evelyn, his voice a tight, controlled whisper. "They have a cop on their payroll. The car that hit Leo. It had a precinct parking pass on the dash." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Are you certain?" "I'm looking at it right now," David said. "This changes everything. We're not just fighting criminals anymore. We're fighting the system that's supposed to protect us from them. I can't trust anyone." "You can trust me," Evelyn said, her voice firm, unwavering. "And you can trust Frank Miller." "What's our next move?" David's mind, trained by years on the force, began to assemble a planar, dangerous, desperate gambit. The leak had to be someone who knew my routines, someone who knew Leo's, They knew his route from school, his schedule. That's not a long list. He paused, a sickening realization dawning on him. And they knew I was about to be suspended. They used my hearing with internal affairs as the perfect window of opportunity, knowing my attention would be elsewhere. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Only a handful of officers knew the specific timing of his IA hearing, and one name rose to the surface, a name that made his stomach churn with disbelief and rage: Officer Kowski, a younger cop David had mentored, taken under his wing, a man who had been to his apartment for a barbecue, who had met Leo, who had listened with sympathetic ears as David vented about his off-the-books investigation. "It's Kowski," David said, the name leaving a foul taste in his mouth. "How do you know?" Evelyn asked. "He was the one who found a key witness who contradicted my report in an old drug case, the one that got Thorne off the hook years ago. He was playing a long game. He gained my trust. He knew everything. They had to draw him out. They had to be sure, and they needed proof. We need to set a trap," David said, "and we have to use the one thing they're afraid of, a living witness." The plan they concocted was terrifying in its simplicity. With Frank Miller's help, they would leak a piece of misinformation through the precinct's rumor mill. The target of the leak would be a notoriously gossipy desk sergeant Frank knew he could trust to spread the word. The rumor: Leo was showing signs of waking up. He was responding to stimuli, and Dr. Reed believed he might be able to identify the car, maybe even the driver, once he regained consciousness. It was a lie. A carefully crafted piece of bait. Leo's condition remained unchanged, a fragile stasis between life and death. But if Kowski was the mole, he would hear the rumor, and he would have to report it to his employers, who would, in turn, feel compelled to silence the only witness before he could talk. The next 24 hours were the most agonizing of David's life. He and Frank, now fully committed to the shadow operation, coordinated with Evelyn and the hospital's head of security. A former detective, Frank knew from his early days on the force. They set up a perimeter. Plainclothes security guards, loyal to the hospital, were stationed at every entrance to the pediatric wing. Evelyn moved Leo to a private room at the end of a secluded corridor, a room with only one point of entry. David sat in a darkened security office down the hall, his eyes glued to a bank of monitors showing the live feed from a hidden camera placed in Leo's room. His heart pounded with a mixture of fear and a cold, vengeful fury. Frank was with him, his hand resting on the grip of his holstered weapon. Just after 2 a.m., when the hospital was at its quietest, they saw him. A figure dressed in dark, orderly scrubs, a baseball cap pulled low, moved down the corridor. He pushed a cleaning cart, his movements furtive. He paused at the door to Leo's room, glancing both ways before slipping a key card through the lock. The door clicked open. The man slipped inside. On the monitor, David saw him approach Leo's bed. The man reached into the pocket of his scrubs. He wasn't pulling out a mop, he was pulling out a syringe. But as the man turned slightly, the camera caught his face under the dim light. It wasn't Kowski. David's blood froze. It was a known enforcer for the syndicate, a man named Petro. They had sent a professional killer. Just as Petro raised the syringe, the door to the room burst open. It wasn't Frank or the hospital security. It was Officer Kowski, his own service weapon drawn. "Police! Drop it, Petro!" Kowski yelled. Petro spun around, surprised, and lunged at Kowski. A desperate struggle ensued. For a heart-stopping moment, David thought his plan had backfired spectacularly. Was Kowski a hero after all? Had he been hunting the leak himself? Then on the monitor, David saw it. As the two men grappled, Kowski wasn't trying to subdue Petro. He was trying to get the syringe. He wasn't there to stop the assassination. He was there as backup, to make sure the job was done. The plan wasn't to leak information. It was for Kowski to create a distraction at the nurses' station while Petro did the deed. But the hospital's security lockdown had foiled that, forcing them into this desperate improvisation. At that moment, Frank and 2 security guards stormed the room. "Freeze! CPD!" Outnumbered and caught, Kowski and Petro froze. The game was up. Kowski looked from the syringe on the floor to David, who now stood in the doorway, his face a mask of cold fury. The betrayal in Kowski's eyes was quickly replaced by the flat, dead expression of a man who knew he was finished. The trap had worked. The monster was caught. But looking at his son, still unconscious in the bed, David knew the victory was a hollow one. The battle was over, but the war for his son's life was still raging. The arrest of Officer Kowski sent shockwaves through the 18th District. The betrayal was a deep septic wound in the department's morale. Under interrogation, Kowski's carefully constructed composure shattered. He gave up everything. The name of his contact, the structure of the syndicate, and the identity of the ghost who ran it all. It was, just as David had suspected long ago, the untouchable real estate developer, Marcus Thorne. Thorne's empire, it turned out, was built on a foundation of laundered drug money. The hit on Leo was a direct order from Thorne himself, an act of vicious retaliation against the cop who was getting too close. With Kowski's testimony and the evidence David and Evelyn had gathered, the case was airtight. Federal agents, who had their own nascent investigation into Thorne, swept in. Thorne's arrest was front-page news, a spectacular fall from grace for one of the city's most powerful men. For David, the victory felt distant, muted. His world was still confined to the four walls of a hospital room, his focus singular. He sat by Leo's bedside, the din of the outside world fading into an irrelevant hum. The legal storm had passed, but the personal one remained. On the 10th day after the surgery, Evelyn came into the room. She was holding a tablet, her expression cautiously optimistic. "I have something to show you," she said, her voice soft. She showed him the screen. It was a new brain scan. "See here," she pointed. "The swelling has decreased by nearly 60%. The pressure is well within the normal range. His brain is healing, David. It's healing beautifully." As if on cue, a flicker. David's breath caught in his throat. Leo's eyelids were fluttering. His fingers, which David had been holding, twitched. "Leo?" David whispered, leaning in close, his heart a wild drum against his ribs. "Buddy, can you hear me?" "Ah!" Slowly, groggily, Leo's eyes opened. They were unfocused at first, hazy with confusion. They scanned the room, landing on David's face. A spark of recognition. "Dad?" The voice was a weak, raspy thread of sound, but it was the most beautiful thing David had ever heard. Tears streamed down David's face, hot and unchecked. He squeezed his son's hand gently. "I'm here, son. I'm right here." Leo's gaze drifted past his father, settling on Evelyn. He didn't know who she was, but he saw the kindness in her eyes. He gave her a small, sleepy smile before his eyes drifted shut again, this time into a natural, healing sleep. In that moment, the last of the animosity between David and Evelyn dissolved, washed away by the overwhelming tide of relief. They stood together in the quiet of the room, no longer adversaries but two people bound by a shared, profound experience. A week later, Evelyn formally withdrew her complaint with the Internal Affairs Division. The same day, David was cleared of all wrongdoing, and his suspension was lifted. Sergeant McAllister called him personally, offering a sincere apology and his badge back. They met one last time in the hospital's small, sunlit atrium, just before Leo was scheduled to be discharged. "I owe you everything," David said, the words feeling small and insufficient for the magnitude of his gratitude. "You saved him." "We saved him," Evelyn corrected gently. "You fought for him just as hard as I did." She paused, a thoughtful expression on her face. "The night you pulled me over, I saw you as nothing more than an obstacle. A monster in a uniform. I was wrong. And I saw you as a symbol of everything I resented," David admitted. "A person of privilege who didn't have to play by the rules. I was wrong, too. I let my own history blind me. That night, I wasn't upholding the law. I was just angry. And I took it out on you." A quiet understanding passed between them. They would never be close friends. Their shared history was too fraught with pain for that. But they had found something rarer, a mutual, hard-won respect, a recognition of the complex, flawed, and ultimately decent human being in the other. David didn't return to patrol. The idea of it, the constant judgment calls on the street, now felt different. The line between right and wrong seemed less defined, more nuanced. He accepted a position as an instructor at the police academy. He wanted to teach the next generation of cops not just procedure and law but empathy. He wanted to teach them to see the person, not just the infraction. Months later, Evelyn stood at a press conference, not as a surgeon, but as a founder. She announced the creation of the Lily Reed Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to providing legal and financial support to the families of children who were victims of violent crime. It was a way to give her daughter's memory a new, powerful purpose. The final scene finds David in a classroom, standing before a room full of fresh-faced recruits. They are young, eager, and see the world in the same black and white terms he once did. On the large screen behind him is a slide with two photos side by side, one of a police badge, the other of a surgeon's scalpel. Power, he tells the recruits, his voice steady and sure, comes in many forms. This badge gives you power. A surgeon's skill gives them power. But power without empathy is just a weapon. It's a tool for breaking things, for breaking people. He clicks to the next slide. It's a picture of Evelyn, smiling, shaking hands with a family at her foundation's launch. I once met a woman who taught me that the fine line between a hero and a monster isn't about the uniform you wear or the authority you hold. It's about a choice, the choice to listen, the choice to understand, the choice to see the humanity in someone, even when they're at their worst. He looks out at the sea of young faces, the future of the force, and feels a flicker of hope. The work was hard. The world was complicated. But healing, he had learned, was always possible. For his son, for his city, and for himself.